Welcome to Baruch College and the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. My name is David Birdsell. I'm the Dean of the Marxe School, and I am delighted to be here today with all of the distinguished people to my right to talk about university-city relations. Let me take a couple of minutes, if I may, to outline some of the issues that we're going to get into today before I introduce our guests. There has been a question that goes back well over a century at this stage about how open universities should be to the communities in which they're situated. Universities are obviously responsible for educating people within a district, often beyond a district. We think about the national and international draws of our elite universities globally. But how much should they focus on the immediate environment? How much should the immediate environment, the city itself, look at universities as assets? And how deliberately might cities engage those assets to improve the fortunes of the city and the university itself? There are all kinds of tensions here, and I want to suggest in a quotation from a Dutch scholar, Herbert van der Woesten, who tells us that universities may close their doors on the outside world to a larger or smaller extent. The urge to do this has been different over time and across places. Although the optimal degrees of closure is hard to find, complete closure is out of the question, and complete openness by its nature dissolves the university as a distinct unit. This also has not happened. Universities throughout their history oscillate on the open-close continuum. So this is something that has happened for a very long time. Let's take this to New York very specifically. My colleagues and I did a review of 92 mayoral inaugural addresses and State of the City addresses. And of those 92, three mention the fact that there is a university in New York. There are, in fact, 110 university campuses, counting each of the 24 city university campuses as one, 110 university campuses within the 5 boroughs of New York. But as of this writing, there is no office in the city that is titled University Relations. There is in Boston. There is in Philadelphia. There is in Seattle. There's not here. So how can we think about trying to maximize these relationships? One last slide, and then I want to turn this over to our guests who know much more about this topic than I. This is one notion of what we might be thinking about when we think about city and university relationships. In the center of this wheel are client organizations, government, non-governmental organizations, or in the US context, nonprofits, performance and exhibition venues, businesses, hospitals, small interest groups, civil society, foundations, religious entities. And with any one of those kinds of entities, we might engage in the kind of activities that you see on the outer wheel, that we can be in the universities seats of culture. We think about the Baruch Performing Arts Center here and the tremendous value provided to the surrounding community in terms of theatrical productions and other activities. Athletics, design and placemaking, like the 25th Street Plaza, which is remaking this neighborhood as we speak and will be fully landscaped and fully reformed by the end of next summer. Strengthening civil society, economic development, public health partnerships, such as the terrific work done at Virginia Commonwealth University to leverage that university's historic commitment to healthcare to remake Richmond as a healthier city than it was before VCU started to do that work. As conveners, as research partners, as developers of human capital. Lots of ways that we can do things that often we do, and Marianne's going to talk a little bit more about the literally hundreds of individual projects that the city does with universities, but how can we make that bigger and better? Here to talk about that today, we have a terrific trio of speakers, and I'll introduce them very briefly. You have their biographies right here, and we're going to start at the end with Ken Nuckolls, the longtime President and Chief Executive Officer of the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. We welcome you back to the college.
Thank you.
Wonderful to see you here again. Next to Ken is Marianne Schwetzman. She is the Executive Director of the Center for Innovation Through Data Intelligence of the New York City Mayor's Office. Those of us, like the faculty in this school, who are dedicated to evidence-based policy, are delighted to have a scholar and a professional devoted to mining data to make city operations more effective. And to my immediate right is Steve Diner, who is a university professor at Rutgers and a former chancellor of the Rutgers Newark campus. Steve has recently released this wonderful book, which I've had the great pleasure of reading and I've learned a tremendous amount from, Universities in Their Cities. And what Steve does is to take the issues that Herbert van der Woesten talked about in that opening quote and has walked it through a couple of centuries worth of American history to think about how universities and their surrounding environments, focusing on cities, have behaved. And this book is available for sale outside. Please do not leave without one, and credit cards are accepted, all major credit cards. So with that, let me begin the conversation and throw open a question. I'm going to start with you, if I may, Steve.
Sure.
Talk a little bit about the way that cities and universities have interacted historically and what the opportunity sets look like today.
Okay, do you have 2 hours?
No,
I mean, that's what the book is.
Yes.
But there is a significant history of anti-urbanism in American higher education. And it was largely believed, at least till the end of World War II, that college was about building character in young men and then later to young women, and you couldn't build character in a city. And so how did that manifest itself? Well, we'll take Columbia. Columbia moved 3 times to escape the city. So did Penn. When it finally made its 3rd move, it figured sooner or later cities are going to catch up with us. So even though we're in the countryside now, we're going to build a wall around our campus and plant lots of trees, because one way to build character, they believed, was to have people close to trees and nature and all of that. And one of my favorite examples, because I grew up in the Bronx, was NYU in 1880 decided that it needed an elite residential campus, and you couldn't do that in the city. So they went to the countryside, then known as the Bronx, before it was incorporated into New York. And they built this fabulous, beautiful campus overlooking the Hudson River, University Heights. And when I was in college, I had a bunch of friends who went to NYU, and that was my image of NYU. But then, the neighborhood changed, and of course they sold it to City of New York. It's now Bronx Community College. But more generally, this anti-urbanism in American higher education extends through most of the history of higher education. It begins to change really around the turn of the 21st century. And now it's very, very different. Well, I could go on, but how's that as
that's a great opening, and we'll come back to many of those issues. And this anti-urbanism, we may look at how Felicity in the City has changed that, certainly for
Yes.
NYU, but we'll loop back on that in a moment. Ken, I wonder if you could talk about, you've got several universities within your geographic catchment, and I know a number of university programs. Could you tell us a little bit about how those influence planning for the empowerment zone? How do you think about leveraging university assets in the EZ?
Well, there's Columbia, there is CCNY, there are smaller campuses. Well, we look at it from the vantage point that Columbia, like NYU and those two principally, are big economic engines in the city of New York. Columbia's budget is, I think, about $5 billion. They employ 16,000 people. Where their engagement with the empowerment zone really came into full bloom was about 10 years ago, when they finally, after years and years of assembling property, and full disclosure, prior to coming to the empowerment zone. I was vice president at Columbia. I just saw a former colleague, Keisha. We reunited. So Columbia, for probably 30 years, accumulated property, thinking prospectively, and they had come to the realization, I was not privy to these conversations, but I know anecdotally some years ago, as Mr. Diner just said, I think there was some consideration about leaving New York City. But then there was a realization that a part of the appeal, a large part of the appeal for Columbia was not only the full-blown education you get there, but being in the city of New York. Columbia University's name is actually Columbia University in the city of New York. So when they discovered that a big part of their appeal was being in the city and they were going to have to be there rather than going to Poughkeepsie, which I think was one of the considerations, they knew they had to expand. So they started to assemble property in what is known as Manhattanville. And finally, in 2007, 2006, that's when they approached the city. And in my other hat, I'm vice chair of the New York City Planning Commission. So they had to get a series of zoning changes to permit the expansion into Manhattanville. So what that means is that over and above the 17,000 employees they have now, over the next 10 years, there's going to be an additional 6,000 jobs created on the Manhattanville campus. What that means from the vantage point of the empowerment zone is that those are opportunities, because those 6,000 jobs, only a small percentage of them are pedagogical. They are support service jobs, they are facilities management jobs, they are administrative jobs. So it's been our quest, along with other community-based organizations, to make sure that in filling those jobs, Columbia looks to the immediate neighborhoods: Upper Manhattan, the Empowerment Zone, Washington Heights, Inwood. So we see the expansion of Columbia, which was not without controversy, because Columbia has had an uneven history, going back to 50 years ago and an ill-considered attempt to build a gym in Morningside Heights.
Right.
So that plagued the relationship and perception of Columbia by the immediate surroundings. But I think they've done a lot over the last 2 to 3 decades to mend fences. And I can go into detail, which maybe I'll get an opportunity to, but I think Columbia realizes now that they have to be a good neighbor. And being a good neighbor, certainly you can't admit all students from Harlem and Upper Manhattan, but you can, through your economic development impact, I think make your surroundings better. And I think they seek to do that.
Terrific. Marianne, Ken raises some important issues situated in this case uptown with Columbia, but we see it too with NYU's expansion and sometimes tension, sometimes warm embrace in parts of the community, and in fact, just sticking with NYU, tensions, West Village, warm embrace, Brooklyn, but you know there are different careers. But Ken is also talking about a kind of intentionality on the university side and on the city side. You're in the catbird seat in some ways to look at data collection as that's undertaken by universities, by the city itself. Could you talk a little bit about what projects are underway, whether it's big, bold initiatives like Cornell Technion on Roosevelt Island, or smaller projects to try to understand our city and make it work more effectively?
Sure. I think that perhaps it's best to say how important CUNY is to the city to start off. And that will help me to get into some of the work that the city is doing with CUNY, with other universities as well. And you mentioned economic engine. And for the citizens of New York City, CUNY is the economic engine. It's where us as working class people and first generation young people come to school and get on track to move through the process of going from working class to middle class, or from in many cases from poor to working class, and to have the ability to become lifelong learners, more importantly perhaps, and to know how to perform and be a part of civic society. So the importance of CUNY, in my opinion, can't be underestimated as a group, and it is the city's university, and we have lots of situations whereby we use the students for internships in most of our agencies, whether it's Health and Human Services or in our sanitation and police department. We have internships that young people are coming in, and in some cases, not just young people, people who have coming back to school and want to learn a new career, and they're coming in as a seasoned intern, and it's been really amazingly helpful. Some of the projects that we've been undertaking, and I'm coming from Health and Human Services, so most of my line of thinking is from, if you will, a social work perspective. And that perspective is that social work and social services in New York City embraces lots of skills and experiences that people have. And what we try to do is match the best in math and science to social work. And that's what our center is about. We're about looking at the administrative data in ways that will help us to lead to insights and how to better meet the needs of people. And we've done that in a number of ways. We have people who come in who have math backgrounds, who have computer science backgrounds. They teach us different methods of looking at the data. And with NYU, it's funny you should mention NYU, they have a data
It'll be the
center.
last time, just say.
But I was thinking, why did we work so closely with NYU? And this leads to another issue, is that they got a major grant from a foundation that helped me to train health and human staff analysts in big data methods. And they have a data center that we were able to use and to combine data and to tell a story. In that case, it was about young people on public assistance and what the trajectory into employment is and what industries are best that have a trajectory that we should be helping kids on public assistance, children of families on public assistance, to get into that track. And that was a very useful exercise for us. So we have various initiatives that are underway that we work with our agencies to help them to perform in a way that they're not treating each client the same way. And that whole concept of one size doesn't fit all is very hard for big city bureaucracies. It's really very difficult. So we try to do the analytical work so that it's practical for the agencies to respond to it. And we use the university folks sometimes in our teams, in our work, to look over the methodology and to help us to figure out how we should do this method so that it will have an impact. And that is underway. We've done work with looking at homeless prevention. And there were 3 variables that came up. 2 years worth of work, and we have to realize what it takes. But people who live in apartments where we had to do emergency repairs, or that there's excessive, that leans against the building. So and others where they were formerly homeless in the building. But it's interesting, just those 3 variables helped us in our prevention program to have more of a targeted approach to going into communities and going into not just individual people, but actually the structural issues of building. So in Health and Human Services, we're often looking at the people question, and we often don't look at the structural issues of what's happening in communities. And more we've been doing that kind of work of bringing in the structural issues and the people issues as well. So that has been what has bringing forth a lot of the initiatives in Health and Human Services. I will also say, too, that there's probably 3 areas that we've been focused on in this under the de Blasio administration. And frankly, the effects of racism in our community make there are just unbelievable outcomes. So we did put out a disparity report on health outcomes, educational outcomes, justice outcomes, to just see this from a city perspective and to get honest about what's happening, because so many good things are happening in education. More kids are graduating than ever before. However, when we see what's happening, the kids who are dropping out and not graduating, we see the disparity among Black and Latino kids, young people who are not graduating. And that yes, it's great that the rates are up, but they're not up, but we still have these kinds of disparities. So we've been looking at how to resolve some of this and to have this in the forefront when we're doing program development, as well as thinking about two-generational models, that to stop just looking at individuals, but to look at families and to look at structural issues of what's going on in communities in a more holistic way, so that we're not in a position of blaming individuals or blaming neighborhoods. The whole, is New York saying, these are bad neighborhoods. These aren't bad neighborhoods. They're neighborhoods of a lot of loss. And how could we shore that neighborhood up? So I think philosophically, that's what we have been bringing to the data analysis in our work.
Can I just
Please,
comment on that? This is the problem with having a historian around.
Yeah.
In the whole issue of the role of universities in collecting data on cities goes back quite a ways. And starting in the late 60s, early 70s, lots and lots of people started saying, well, cities are in crisis. So how are we going to solve the problems of the city? The universities. They'll gather all this data. They'll find what needs to be done, and then policymakers can come in and do what the university scholars tell them. And there was, needless to say, some people were very skeptical about this. David Reisman, the famous sociologist, said, universities are about teaching and research. They're not about community service. They're not about changing the city. But there was a very pioneering case in the 70s in which Columbia and New School established an entity that would provide data annually on the city's fiscal situation and all of that. And when they issued their first report, Mayor Koch was furious because it was critical and said that some of the things the city leaders were saying were actually not accurate. And that's an issue. It's always an issue. If universities are going to do research or scholars and be honest, then they're going to run into problems as well as be helpful.
Yeah, no, that's actually a tension. We just had a report whereby we were looking at eviction and who gets evicted and some of the data. And we had a nice, smart PhD student doing his dissertation, and when he found that certain judges that there was some, we were like, oh, right now, do you have to say about the judges? Can you leave that out just for now? When you go and write it up, so people were a little concerned. The city doesn't want to come out criticizing judges, and so, at the same time, he is a doc student doing his dissertation, and we don't want to control what he has to say. So that's something that we figure out usually in the beginning of a project by saying, look, the city has time to review what you're doing, and then we write that we did not consent to whatever is being said here.
Well, let me surface a couple of issues here, because we've got a lot on the table right now. We've got the notion of university as an economic engine and a creator of space, of jobs, and of economic activity. We've got the notion of the university as a locus of expertise. We've got the notion of the university as a strategic partner in a host of urban issues. But there are tensions here, right? I mean, that whether we look at the Reisman quote or other commentary from the Academy is not a social service agency, right? I mean, we exist to do research, we exist to do excellent education, which may or may not comport with the timelines and expectations of any locality at any time, although there are often crosswalks and overlaps. So a question for all three of you. And Linda, by the way, speaking of questions, how are we doing questions today? Yes, we are. On cards or? Cards. Okay. I'm going to go through this round of this question, but then it's your turn. The way that we're doing this today is to write questions on cards. You should all have cards on the table in front of you. Linda Haley will be coming by to collect those cards. She'll give those to me, and I'll read your questions out so that our panelists can address those questions. But here's my question for you while everybody's jotting down their own thoughts at this point. How do we square the circle between university expectations and how they might be made more useful to the localities that they serve? Just to give you an idea of some of the clash, a scholar will take as much time as she needs to answer a question, and she's not going to be bound by the fact that there's an election in 8 months, or that you need to turn in a report for an agency whose commissioner has demanded action by the end of February, or whatever it is. But you want those insights, and it might be uncomfortable at times because they're politically perhaps less than thoroughly useful, but you want to have that clear independence, and the university wants to be independent, but many scholars, and I love the notion that scholars will decree and then public officials will adopt. I mean, that's the way it works, right, colleagues? We always see it work that way. How can we make ourselves more useful to one another?
I agree there's tension, but I don't think that there's necessarily a conflict. I think that urban centers, especially now when the federal government continues its decades-long march away from urban centers, we can no longer look to the federal government for funds for housing, for health care, transit. They're turning their backs away. So I think municipalities and leaders, mayors, and indeed governors need to look to universities as sources of strategic expertise. I mean, they can't, nor should they, be looked to necessarily that, well, how do we balance our budget, you know? But there are large problems that cities have to deal with. And I think universities, when charged with specific kinds of formulations that need to be made, can really play a strategic role. I mean, New York City has issues of workforce development that we need to deal with. How do you join sectors, growth sectors, with populations that aren't necessarily going to college, right, but need to and can be made to be a source of employment and a source of economic activity for sectors like healthcare, for instance, and others. So I think that municipalities need to. Every municipality has an office of management, strategic. Right. At least they like to think they do. Yeah. So I think we need to look to universities for their strengths and seek to engage them around large issues that continue to challenge municipalities and state governments.
Terrific, thank you. And just before I pivot away from you, can you talk a little bit about the specific role of community colleges in that equation, whether with regard to allied health professions or whatever?
Well, again, I think in the area of workforce development, and I'm not saying that community colleges should become vocational schools necessarily, but I think getting a liberal arts degree is fine, but in an economy that is shrinking, where opportunities are not as full as they were 30, 40 years ago. I think community colleges have a specific role to bridge the gap between, populations that need to be educated, but making the link between those populations and sectors that are going to be sources of employment. I think they need to prepare students to enter the world of work in a competitive fashion and hopefully prepared to be able to contribute. That's not the role that you think that CUNY, or at least, the four-year schools are going to do, or Columbia or NYU, but I think the community colleges, that is a niche that they need to fill.
Sounds like the founding mission statement for the Harlem Community Campus, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Marion, what do we do to square the circle? How do we make ourselves more available and useful to one another?
I think it goes down to basic relationships. And having a forum or having a way to develop relationships, because there's misunderstanding on both ends. There's misunderstanding. I just worked with a group from CUNY, actually, and they thought we had data that we actually don't have.
Right.
And so, and one group actually was getting annoyed with me because they thought I was withholding something, and I actually nobody has this data.
Luckily, there's only one CUNY office that gets annoyed with anybody who specifically casts
but in part, it's developing relationships and understanding what the give and take is.
Right.
Because university folks can help us to really hone down on what's the right question. And getting the right question is no easy matter at times. It
Right.
takes time to get the right question. And having groups where you're thinking about what would be the most important question in this situation matters, that would be helpful. So I think there is sometimes there's a misunderstanding, just as you described in the new school example, that government thinks you're going to hurt them, and you think government is not going to give you something, and that in some cases that's true, but I think there are a lot of mutual goals. So if we can get that mutual goal, and universities have to do what they have to do, and that's great. One tension I think for me I see is that putting together these data sets is an awful lot of work. That's
Yes.
where, if you wanted to look at child welfare, juvenile justice, public assistance, putting these data sets to analyze takes a lot of work. And what happens is that there's no mechanism to give you that integrated data set. It's still an old-fashioned MOU to each of those agencies.
Right.
And so government hasn't made it easy for researchers to come in and say, oh, we like that question, we like what you're thinking about, here's a data set you could use. And in our world, it's because our data sets are people, and we have to be their privacy concerns and confidentiality concerns. At the same time, one doesn't want to hide behind those concerns, not to learn what we should be doing or what we're not doing that we should be doing.
So one thing we might do is think about a proposal process for creating useful data sets out of the university community to the city.
Yeah,
And
I saw this package at UPenn where in their business school, they have the data sets of every top company in the world. And that's what those kids are learning on. I'm thinking to myself, no wonder why they're coming out of that school making all sorts of money. They know what these data sets are saying and what's happening. And it's called 300 words plus or something. It's at UPenn. It's an unbelievable situation. That's something that you would think that maybe CUNY could use some data sets that would be helpful for students to learn. And then they really understand what's going on with the city.
And that's a terrific thought. And of course, there are some such things, such as our geographic information
Yes.
systems
Yeah.
and geospatial and analytic capabilities throughout the system. But if we can take the long view, Steve,
Yeah.
which is your specialty here, I wonder if you could talk about what you've seen as particularly successful and reflect particularly on a term that you've written about both in the book and in an article, I think it was in the Journal of Higher Education, about the urban grant notion. Which picks up off of the land grant institutions out of the Morrill Act in 1862. But should we have an urban version of that? And Clark Kerr and others have championed that over the years.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'd say is there is a long, long history of conflict between universities and their neighborhoods based on expansion. The universities would acquire land, they tear things down, they kick out some people, or even when they didn't do that, there's a growing sense, particularly after the 50s and 60s, that the university will help produce what we call gentrification. You know, by building over here and building student housing and maybe faculty housing, you're going to attract the upper middle class to the central city, and that's going to ultimately push out poor people and minorities and the like. So there's been a very, very long history of this at all kinds of institutions, not just at Columbia. University of Chicago, for example, had all sorts of issues with the neighborhood, as did numerous other institutions. One of the things that this resulted in was the various higher education associations began holding workshops on, well, how do we get along with our neighbors, essentially? You know, teaching presidents and vice presidents and so on, how do you deal with neighborhood relations, and in particular with regard to construction and expansion. And so in recent years, most universities that are planning expansion have created an entity that brings together the university and various community groups and government, and creates a sort of unified entity to go forward with plans for neighborhood revitalization and the like. And I give a couple of examples of that in the book. So that's one point I'd make. But a second thing is when urban universities first came about, they pioneered in enabling students to learn in the city. And back when education was considered something to be contained on the campus and not involve the corrupt outside world, universities and cities started internships, experiential learning, and those kinds of opportunities in teaching and also in research, you know, for faculty research and also student research. And so I would say that continues to be a very important entity to build, you know, a community, community and university relationships. And by the way, nowadays, this was, you know, on the extremes, but nowadays, experiential learning, civic engagement, this is mainstream. Doesn't matter where a university is located. Everyone's saying, oh, we have to teach civic engagement now and the like. Well, universities in cities have much greater opportunities to do that. And it's very important not only to build civic responsibility on the part of young people, students. It's important in that way, but it's also important in terms of their learning experiences. Today, we don't think learning can occur just in the classroom or just in books. So that's another dimension. And then I would mention very quickly, I headed Rutgers Newark as chancellor for 10 years. And from day one, I said, we are an urban university. We are in downtown Newark. Lots of people around the country think Newark is decrepit and falling apart, but Newark has great resources, and I started programs of grants to faculty to take students into the city, to do research in the city, set up an urban research center largely focused on the city. And the whole point was the leadership of an urban university really needs to embrace the city. And look, I met with the mayor, I met with members of the council. The mayor occasionally called me and said, we need you to do research on this and that. And I said, well, that's something we can't do. But more often than not, we were able to do what they needed. And it became very important to connect the university visually, publicly, with the city. Now, you asked me one other thing.
We talked about urban grant.
Oh, yes, the urban grant. Starting in the 60s, universities and cities began arguing that the federal government should support universities and cities in the same way that they supported agriculture in the 19th century with the land grant institutions. And of course, land grant institutions still get federal money. So they came up with this concept of urban grant universities. And the idea was, and it was of course mistaken, but they said, since the land grant university solved all the problems of agriculture, and it didn't. Now we need land grant universities, urban land grant universities, to solve the problems of cities. And that idea has been going on. Actually, I was part of a group of university presidents that met with members of Congress a couple of years ago to lobby for such a bill. It took different forms in different years, but I haven't heard anything about it since Trump was elected, but
His commitment to evidence-based policy is second to none.
Right. But anyhow, the point is that now, of course, this is self-interested. The leaders of urban universities, they'd like to get federal money, more federal money. But the fact is that they are doing it arguing that universities are integral to the needs of cities, and therefore the federal government should be supporting them.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I have a sheaf full of wonderful questions here. There are far too many to ask all of them. So with your permission, including one, by the way, written in the most beautiful Palmer method longhand that I've seen in a long while. So I'm going to, with your permission, be mixing and matching as much as possible. One of them is about civic education. I think Steve did an excellent job of overviewing that. We have, however, focused a lot on the kinds of university-city relations that would be based in policy shops like the Marxe School. But one of our members of the audience asks, what contributions can scholars from the humanities and other fields outside of the social sciences make to university-city relations? I'm inclined to start with the historian, but why don't we start instead with people in the realm of professional practice?
In the humanities, give me an example.
So whether it's the critical thinking skills, the deep historical knowledge of the sort that Steve is bringing to bear today, the ability to think creatively about how we represent the city in our neighborhoods, some of those kinds of things.
Well, I think those are all skill sets that can be deployed. And I just think city leaders have to think again strategically about how to best use this. I mean, whether they be deployed on a given day or a given month within the public school system.
Right.
Or whether or not it's a part of the formulation about how a city can better project itself. Or, if you're trying to woo Amazon, what
Who'd do
strengths
that?
what strengths do you want to project? So, again, I just think it's there's a wealth of opportunity for those kinds of collaboration.
Okay, terrific. Steve, Marion?
Well, what I think of, and this is humanities, folks who have that gift and talent often are able to tell a story in a more interesting way than somebody like myself. So it really, humanities helps sometimes to deepen and provide a depth to something that from a human point of view, that we all can relate to. And
Absolutely.
so those values and importance are really important to the city to be able to convey that.
So critical membership in a team at the very least. Steve, this is very much your wheelhouse.
This is very much. It seems to me rudimentary that it is very important for universities or scholars in universities to help people in their communities know their history, to understand how we got here. Often, in many cases, as for example in Newark, Newark has a very, very rich history. It has a complex of cultural institutions that are profoundly important, and almost nobody knows about them. And so one of the really important things is to enable the community itself and political leaders, government leaders, and the larger society to understand how we got here, what the history is, and the like. And some of that is frankly getting people to understand why central cities deteriorated. They didn't just deteriorate. They deteriorated because of housing discrimination. That meant black people couldn't move to the suburbs, but white people could. They deteriorated for a whole range of economic issues and decisions made by state government, and taxes, and so on. So, and by the way, they're revitalizing now, also not just in the abstract, but there are a whole variety of entities, including universities, that are working to attract upper middle class people and make the cities more attractive and bring more suburbanites to come to the city and shop and go to the arts and all of that.
So the humanities help us know ourselves and keep us honest.
Yes.
Very important. Ken, this next one is for you. How much of a role did Columbia play in gentrifying Harlem, doing the 125th Street redevelopment and expansion, and has that been positive or negative overall?
Well, I don't think they've played thus far that large a role. The transformation of Harlem, if you want to call it that, has been gradual. Nothing happens in New York City overnight. There's a gradualism to it. And I've been around government for about 40 years, so I've seen what happened in Harlem really began with the renewal that Ed Koch started in the late 80s when he decided to put $5 billion into the rehabilitation of city-owned in-rim properties that had been abandoned. In the South Bronx, where I was deputy borough president, to Fernando Ferrer, we had about 40...
A proud graduate of this institution.
Right, NYU, Bronx campus.
And Baruch for his MPA.
Oh, okay, all right. But when the city made a determination to put capital dollars, which theretofore had not been done, into the renewal of Harlem and the South Bronx, that began to recapture at least the housing stock. And then in the 90s, frankly, under Rudy Giuliani, some of us had great issues with that tenure, but Dave Dinkins had done something that still is not sufficiently recognized when he brought 6,000 through Safe Cities, Safe Streets. He hired 6,000 police officers that was the foundation for the reduction in crime that happened principally under Giuliani, but it had started under Dinkins.
That's right.
The perception of safety in Harlem began to take hold, and that's when people started to look at Harlem for its assets. Great housing stock, great transportation system, centrally located. And that's when you began to see this gradualism of people coming back. Now, the empowerment zone also played a role because while we focused on commercial and retail development, when we provided capital for what is now Harlem, USA, where big first retail center of its kind on 125th Street, that sent a message to the development community that, you can invest up here. Yeah. And it doesn't get burned down or whatever people were thinking. So all of those things came together, and with the rising cost of housing, frankly, in other parts of Manhattan, people seeking value began to look northward. Right. So all of these factors have contributed to gentrification. Now, where Columbia comes in, because Manhattanville, which was a low-rise industrial area, and when Columbia's rezoning came before the City Planning Commission, I was no longer at Columbia, I was at the empowerment zone. But I voted for it based on the following factors. I believed and still believe that given the choice between a nonprofit institution that was going to invest and could create amenities and services for the surrounding community versus speculative development, I thought the nonprofit option was better, because cobblestone streets near the Hudson River sooner or later would give way to real gentrification, and you'd have a luxury real estate development kind of environment up there that I think would have paid no attention to Manhattanville and would have created real tensions. So I think at the end of the day, while Columbia is a magnet for investment, and you're going to see probably a lot more development in that area, I think given the choices, and if you're really interested in the long-term benefits for the surrounding community, and public housing is going to be there. So I think public housing, Manhattanville houses are better situated across the street from Columbia University than from luxury condos that sooner or later would have come there.
Great.
Can I just add that City College was also very much involved in the redevelopment of Harlem and the so-called gentrification.
Absolutely, and we don't want to forget our CUNY neighbor to the north.
Yeah.
There are a number of questions. We're just about out of time, but I'm going to press together about a half a dozen questions about university finances, and I'll tick off several items and ask for your responses. So a number of people are very concerned about the tax bill currently making its way through Congress and how it will now imperil graduate student support by counting that as income and requiring that graduate students, and undergraduates for that matter, who receive that support pay taxes on the value of their tuition remissions and other scholarship dollars. Others are concerned about the less than cozy relationship between the mayor and the governor and what that might portend for financing of higher education, particularly in the City University of New York. And at least one of the members of the audience is concerned from the other end about universities' failure to pony up through property taxes given their tax-exempt status, and whether we should be exacting payments in lieu of taxes of some sort in the City of New York. So let me throw open that large basket of financial concerns. Not all at once, please.
Well, I don't want to speak for the mayor, but certainly the mayor and the governor as much as it may not always appear, do agree on certain aspects, and they do have the residents and students and folks who are going to be affected by this tax bill. There's huge agreement about this. So I don't see that as necessarily a terrible discourse going on that issue.
So broad support for the universities.
So I think that there's support on that this would be devastating to our city.
You know, there's a forum coming up, I think Abney's having it, where they're going to have several Republican congressmen representing New York, Peter King, and I think his name is Zeldin from upstate. Hopefully this will be an issue because if that component, along with taking away deductibility for tuition reimbursement, that could be devastating to New York. And I think it's incumbent upon the Republican contingent of New York to a greater degree, frankly, than their Democratic counterparts, because they run Washington. So if they are really concerned about the well-being of their constituents, then they ought to make sure that those tax benefits survive this tax act.
I was speaking at a program last night at my institution about the book, and someone asked me the same question. But they asked, what impact will it have on Rutgers Newark? Obviously, I think, the proposed, taxes are terrible, and I'm absolutely against them. But the taxing of stipends for graduate students is going to, reduce the number of graduate students. In any number of fields, it won't be a huge loss. Sadly, my own history, there are too many historians out there and they can't get jobs, and this is true in English and philosophy and a lot of other fields. In the sciences, which are really important, everybody knows are really important to economic development, the funding for graduate students is often based on grants for research, and whether that would be taxable or not is not clear. But I'm saying it's not. I think it would be a terrible thing, but I think what it would do is reduce graduate enrollments, which are falling anyhow, and it probably won't have all that much impact on undergraduate enrollment.
That is probably true. This is, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap here, and I know that there are a number of questions, but we are out of time, and I want to be mindful of the commitments that we've made to our speakers. Let me close with just 3 points. First of all, I want to acknowledge a question that I think might be a Community Board 6 question about whether Baruch is a good neighbor. And I would argue that Baruch is an excellent neighbor. We create lovely plazas. We live in a wonderful neighborhood, and we've actually propelled a number of the kinds of programs that we've been talking about here today. For executive education with city agencies and nonprofits, for data analytics across a wide range of issues, and for arts programs available to the entire community, which run practically every day of the week. And we're very proud of all of that and very grateful to be living here just north of Gramercy Pike. The second thing that I would like to do is to point out that on your tables is a form, an evaluation form. Linda's holding up a copy right now. Please do fill that out. We love to know how we're doing, and to put on programs that directly speak to the needs that you tell us you're interested in hearing about. And finally, and most importantly, number 3, I want you to join me in thanking terrific panelists Ken Knuckles, Maren Schretzman, Steve Diner, who have told us so much about this interesting project. This is, I would argue, a vital concern for all of us here. I know many people are from Baruch College and other CUNY campuses, others of you from agencies in the city. Let's keep this conversation going, because this is about multiplying value, and now, if not now, when should we be talking about ways that universities affect every aspect, ideally, of our lives and make our cities better places? Thanks so much for coming today.